Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll look at the overdraft risks in net, the goaltenders that are most likely to get drafted a little bit too high, and guys you'll want to avoid if that's the case. This will also tie into the #1 rule for the data draft strategy, which is don't draft a goalie in the first or second round. Now, quick disclaimer, the rankings used for this video are for a category league with standard goalie categories, goals against, save percentage, wins, and shutouts. And the results may vary for points league, so you have to adjust to your point weighting system. And the ratings used for this, the goalie rankings, the ratings you're seeing in all these slides, are all of those categories plus a games played percentile, a goals saved above expected, and a team expected goals against per game component, which gives us a sense of whether the goalie is a heavy starter, whether he's skilled, and whether he's playing behind a good defensive team, which are all things we look for in fantasy goaltenders. Now, the criteria for this analysis, this is not my opinion. This is a data analysis project I did. And we're looking for a significant deviation between what the goalie did last year and his 5-year rating average. So we went over this in the forward and defenseman version of this video. Anybody who was within a certain channel, maybe 65, 70, and then all of a sudden pops up and hits a 90, that's what we're going to look out for. That's a red flag that we want to make sure that we're investigating so that we don't draft those guys too high. We want somebody who's going to be one of the top 20 goalies last year because those are the guys that are going to get drafted really high. You're not going to pick a goalie who is, 25th or 30th best goalie and draft him too high. You're typically going to pick the guys who were top 5 or top 10 last year. We also don't really want a guy who's showing a steady upward trend in the right direction. Typically, those guys are improving steadily year over year. A lot of younger players do this. They get in the league, they start a little bit slow, they start to pick up momentum, and we want to filter a lot of that out. There will be some of those types of graphs, as you'll see, but we'll explain those as we go through. But we'll start at number 5, we'll go down to number 1, and at number 5 we have a goalie who I definitely would want to own, but there is a significant risk here, and that's Jake Oettinger. So Oettinger is still an elite G1 in fantasy. He's a clear starter. There's no question about that. Played 62 games last year. There's a clear upward trend in his rating, as you can see, but it's massive gaps in between the two. And again, this is what I was talking about, where we do see a younger player still improving, and he's going in the right direction each year and taking a healthy jump between each season. Dallas is the second best defensive team in the NHL. He was 12th in the NHL in goals saved above expected, and he's only 24 years old, so he's right in the prime of his career. These are all good things to think about when you want to draft Jake Oettinger. But why is he on this list? So he went from a 70.72 in 21-22 to a 91.05 last year. That's a 28.7% jump from year to year. And his 3-year average is 72.24, so that's a 26% jump from that. Either way you slice it, there is significant risk that he will regress a little bit and come back down to earth. Now, if he does, he might go from a 91 to an 83 or something, and he would still be a top 10 goalie. Jeremy Swayman was the 9th best goalie last year. He was an 83, so he could still be a really good goaltender, but there is risk that he's going to be regressing from this 91 number and the second best goaltender in fantasy last year. Now, we will see at the end of the video how difficult it is for a goalie to be top 5 in fantasy in consecutive seasons. So, when you get to that part of the video, think back to Jake Oettinger because that will pertain to him as well. Now, they lost Colin Miller on the blue line. It looks like Thomas Harley and Nils Lundqvist are penciled into the top 6. Ryan Suter is getting older. He's almost 38 years old, and he's listed on the top pair with Heiskanen. So there are some question marks on their blue line, despite the fact that they're a very good defensive team. So can Dallas be a top 10 defensive team again with a lot of those younger guys getting filtered in? Now, overall, it's a weak argument against Oettinger, but just looking at the 5-year trend graph, here you can see how high he is from his median and from his average. And that would be the main reason why he's due for a potential regression. Now, typically, for young goaltenders that are still improving, that means they could potentially continue this trend, but there's not really a lot of places he can go. He was the second best goalie in fantasy last year, so when you're all the way at the top, there's only one way to go, and that's down. That's why he's number 5 on this list. Up next, we have Alex Georgiev, and this is another guy who's probably going to be a decent goaltender, again, because of the team he plays on, and he was really good last year as well. He was an 87.30. third best goalie in fantasy, given all the criteria we're looking at here. He could be another G1 because there's nobody really pushing him for starts, and he did get 62 games last year. Again, this isn't a list of guys to stay away from, but guys who have a bit more risk because someone in your draft will see their stats from last year and go, oh, he's the best available guy, I'm going to grab him. So here's why you shouldn't do that with Georgiev. He's got a 54.7% deviation from his 5-year average. Now, I get that all of these seasons he was a backup or a 1B in New York, and now he comes over to Colorado, becomes the starter, gets all the time, and rockets up, but that's still a massive gap between a 49.73 and an 87.30, or his median, or his 5-year average, which is a 56. So either way you slice it, there's significant room for regression in his file. Now, secondly, the Avs were 11th in expected goals against last year, and they lost Eric Johnson in the offseason. They obviously still have an elite D-core, but they have a lot of offensive or two-way guys. The only prototypical shutdown D-man they have is Manson, and he missed some time last year. So if that's the case again, they may not be as tight defensively as you would like in your number one guy. The Avs were 16th in the NHL on the penalty kill last year, which is, again, not ideal for your starter. You'd like a guy who's playing for a better penalty killing team because a lot of scoring happens on the power play in the NHL, especially during the regular season. Now, he had a career high 62 starts last year. His previous high was 32 in 1920. Now, he had a career high in 40 wins last year. His previous high was 17. He tied career highs in save percentage, career low goals against average, and career high goals saved above expected. So again, this is another case of asking a guy to repeat a career season with another career season. And he was the third best goaltender in fantasy. And again, what goes up must come down. He's got pretty much nowhere to go but down at this point. But he will still be a good G1. Even if he regresses about 10 points, he'll be a 77, and he would be in this range between 10 and 13. Somebody like Saros. Saros is an excellent goaltender in fantasy. He was a 77. Obviously, he got a lot of work down the stretch, and they were kind of they didn't have the best roster going down the stretch, so he was asked to do quite a bit, which is what dropped his rating a bit. But still, even if Georgiev regresses down to that level, he's still going to be a good option. Just don't grab him before the 4th round. Now, at number 3, we have a guy who's a little bit more obvious in this regard as being a risk, and that's Vitek Vanacek. So there's a number of reasons for this. No doubt he was one of the top fantasy goalies for the first half of last year. New Jersey was the 3rd best defensive team last year and the 8th best the year before that, so they should be able to keep pucks out of their net. But why is Vanacek on this list? So we'll start with inconsistent play. So last year he had decent October, about average, really good November, not good at all in December, excellent in January, really terrible in February and March, and then finished relatively strong in April with a 919. But that's a lot of inconsistent play, and he showed that he really didn't ever get that amount of starts, and he wasn't able to handle that workload, especially when they had, Blackwood was injured for a significant chunk. They had called up Schmid. Schmid was a good option. You could see him right here. He was a 72, almost a 73. So when he got in, he was really good. But they couldn't count on Schmid to play enough games, and I think Vanacek wore down with that workload. In addition to that, 18.96, basically 19% deviation from his 3-year average. He jumped from 60.62 to 84.04. That represents a 38.6% jump from year to year. Now, obviously, he went from Washington to New Jersey, which is an upgrade in terms of defensive structure in front of him. And he could potentially do that again because they do have a really good defensive team in terms of what they have in front of him. But the Devils did lose Ryan Graves and Damon Severson. Graves was a good shot blocker, decent defensively, a penalty killer type of player. Severson was more offensive, won't be as missed defensively for Vanacek, but they're replacing those two with probably Luke Hughes and Simon Nemec, maybe Colin Miller, maybe Kevin Ball, but either way you slice it, they're putting younger players and less experienced players in those roles, and that usually doesn't equate with lower goals against. So we do have to keep that in mind. We're all excited about those 2 high draft picks. They're going to be very fun to watch. I'm terrified as a Rangers fan having to play against them for the next 10 years plus. but they aren't necessarily going to be as stout defensively as they were last year. That is a potential risk. And then on top of that, you're looking at a 19% deviation from his average. And if they're going to expect him to play more than 48 starts, that's not necessarily going to bode well, considering he didn't do well with the workload this year. So they're going to have to insulate him a little bit. And they really didn't do a whole lot in terms of getting him a quality backup to work with, unless you count Schmid, which I would if they want to go that route. But nonetheless, there is significant regression risk with Vanecek, and he was a little bit lower on this list at 8th overall. So there is a little bit of room that he could improve up the list, but I would be more probable that he goes down the list and regresses a little bit to maybe a high 70s or a mid 70s goalie next year. Now, up next is a guy that I owned last year and I loved having on my team. He was a top 5 fantasy goalie during the second half last year, and that's Filip Gustavsson. So he didn't get enough starts, hence why his rating is only an 82. He had a 73rd percentile in terms of games played ratio, 39 games, 22 wins. So not the best in terms of win percentage. 80th percentile is not bad, but you'd like to see a guy with 30 plus wins if he's going to be your G1. He was ranked 10th overall, but if he had maybe 10 more starts, he probably would have been closer to that 87 to 90 range than an 82. He was also 7th in goals saved above expected, 2nd in save percentage behind Ullmark. He put up career highs across the board except for save percentage. He actually had a 933 in 2021 with Ottawa, but that was only 7 starts, so he did it in a much bigger sample size this year. So why is he second on this list? Almost 40% deviation from his 3-year average to his 22-23 rating. So from 21-22 to 22-23, that deviation rises to 134% as he more than doubled his rating from year to year. So he went from a 35 to an 82. That is unheard of. I've never seen those kind of numbers doing this type of analysis. That is obviously significant regression risk. They do have a pretty decent defensive system in place, but Minnesota was 14th in the NHL in expected goals against last year, and then they lost Matt Dumba and essentially replaced him with Brock Faber or Kalen Addison, which increases the likelihood that they regress as a team from where they were defensively last year. Similar argument to what I just said about New Jersey. When you bring in younger, less experienced players to replace veterans that you can't pay, that's obviously going to be a recipe for a little bit higher goals against. On top of that, he took over the net last year, but he is a 1A at best right now. He's not a bona fide starter who's going to play 60 games or so, and he could be drafted as an elite G1 given his numbers. So if you get somebody in your draft that's just looking at last year's numbers, the save percentage, the goals against, look at 931, a 210 goals against, obviously that's going to pique their interest and that's going to catch their eye. If they draft him, they're not going to get an elite G1 because he still has to split time with Marc-Andre Fleury. In addition to that, obviously Minnesota's biggest problem is they have 14 plus million in dead cap space from the buyouts, and that means that there's also a risk that they won't win as many games as they did last year. So even though his win percentile was not great, 22 wins in 39 games is good, it's above 500, but they're probably not going to win as many games as they did last year just because of the fact that they've got to account for 14 million in dead cap space, and they're not going to be able to re-sign Dumba because of that. So there is a lot in the column of potential regression for Filip Gustavsson. As of the recording of this video, he's still not signed. I believe he has an arbitration hearing coming up. I could be wrong about that. If you're watching this video closer to draft season, I'm assuming they signed him and he's going to be playing for Minnesota next year. He is still a really good goaltender. So if he drops a little bit further than, like, I'd say the 5th round is the earliest I would go and grab him, he still puts up really good numbers, and he did so in Ottawa, which shows you that he can do it for a not great defensive team. So he is still a good option in fantasy, but don't try to get him before the 5th round. There is significant regression, obviously, just because of this deviation from year to year and the deviation from his average. That brings us to number 1, and it's got to be Linus Ullmark. There's a number of reasons why he is the number 1 overdraft risk this year. But first, I'll give you the case in favor of drafting Ullmark, just to be nice. First, there's a clear 3-year upward trend, basically since he came over to Boston. So every year he's been in Boston, he's improved. Boston's defense is still basically intact, and they were 7th in the NHL in expected goals against last year. So they didn't lose anybody off the D-core. They were a very good defensive team with good structure. and they still have a lot of those pieces in place on the blue line to be, insulating Ullmark. And he still is a good option if you want to handcuff him with Swayman. The problem is he was a complete tandem in 21-22. They split right down the middle, 41 games apiece. And last year, Swayman got injured a little bit in the first half of the season. Ullmark took over, and he did not look back. He was incredible for the first 2/3 of the season. Then they started resting him down the stretch, and Swayman played arguably better than Ullmark down that last third of the season, which is why he finished in the top 10. So if you have both of them handcuffed together, that's an excellent strategy. But you're going to have to pay a premium for Ullmark because of a lot of the things that we're going to talk about going forward. Now, number 2, Boston lost 4 of their top 7 forwards, as we just mentioned with Jake DeBrusk. That's not necessarily going to impact Ullmark in terms of what's going to be insulating him from a defensive positioning, but it will decrease their wins, obviously. And then on top of that, you lose Bergeron, who is basically like a third defenseman in their own zone. So I could see Boston regressing at least 35 points in the standings to finish with around 100 points this year at best. And some even have them missing the playoffs. So either way you slice it, they're not going to be the team they were last year. Last year, everything went right, and Ullmark essentially was the starter. This year, he's in a pretty much 1A, 1B split, however you want to slice it. They did lose 4 of their top 7, including their top 2 centermen. And then asking anyone to follow up a career season with another career season is, again, obviously risky. .938 save percentage, 1.89 goals against, 40 wins in 49 starts, second in goals saved above expected, won the Vezina, won the Jennings. If you're going to expect him to do that again, that's a fool's errand. You're not going to get return on investment for that. Reason number 4, he's got a 51% deviation from his 5-year average. So 61 is his 5-year average. He was a 92.23 last year, so obviously that's a humongous jump. And then you can see here, even from year to year, going from 69 to 92, that's also a massive jump. And then what I said with Ottinger and Georgiev, there's only one place for him to go, and that's down. When you're looking at it, any way you slice it, if you're at the top of the standings in 1 year and you're not capable of doing the exact same thing again the next year, which is a very tall order, you're going to go down somewhere. You're going to regress maybe even down here 10 spots to maybe 10th best goaltender or whatever. Even if he just plays less games and puts up the same numbers, he will regress to where Swayman is right now. And if you're drafting him as an elite G1 in the first 3 or 4 rounds of the draft, you're going to make a huge mistake. Now, my final point for Ullmark honestly goes for probably all of the goalies that we looked at here. And that is this. So goalies are inconsistent. You're looking at the rankings this year. This is the top 10 this year and the top 10 last year. Only 3 goaltenders were in the top 10 both seasons: Hellebuck, Shesterkin, and Sorokin. And down at the bottom, I've showed you their 5-year rating trend. For Hellebuck, you're looking at a guy who had a humongous increase from 68 to 93. That's 18-19 to 19-20. Then he kind of went downward for a couple of years. Still pretty consistent, though. An 80 is not bad as your low over the last 4 years. Last season, he was an 86.8, basically an 87. And that's right around his median. That's close to his 5-year average. So he's relatively consistent in this channel, and he probably will be able to put up that level of goaltending. Obviously, there's some question marks going on in Winnipeg, so I wouldn't necessarily pick him ahead of these other 2 guys. For Shesterkin, he's been pretty much exactly what you want to see. Consistent improvement from year to year, basically a 70 to a 74 to an 80 to an 85. He's going up about 4 to 6 points every year. That's what you like to see, and he could potentially continue that. The Rangers were 12th in expected goals against last year. They basically kept their entire team intact. There's obvious question marks whether they can do it in the playoffs after losing in the first round last year, but that doesn't matter for fantasy. So he's still trending in the right direction. The only problem there is to get Shesterkin or Sorokin, and usually Vasilevsky, you're going to have to get them in the first or second round. So if you're looking for a G1 in fantasy, you ideally want a guy who's going to start more than 50 starts, a guy who puts up at least a .915, who plays behind a top 15 or top 10 defensive team, and who is has a good enough team that can win him 30 games on his own. And the problem with picking these 3 guys is that you're going to have to get them super early in the draft, and you should never pick a goalie in the first 2 rounds of the draft. So what you're going to look for is the guys who have all of those criteria but aren't going to be drafted that high. Now, if you're wondering why you shouldn't draft a goalie in the first 2 rounds, you can check out these other 2 videos to get an in-depth breakdown of the data. But that's going to do it for this one. Thanks as always, and I'll see you in the next video.